A few weeks ago, we explored Carl Jung's idea of a golden shadow. Those hidden strengths and unrealized capacities that we often overlook and neglect in ourselves. Jung teaches that the people we most idealize can also act as mirrors, reflecting back to us our own untapped potential. Because the reason, part of why we admire them so much, is it's resonating with something within us. And as we cultivate those capacities within us, we can manifest those parts of ourselves that the world most needs right now. Today, though, I want to turn from the more luminous side of Jung's teachings to the harder, more challenging half, the shadow itself. Whereas our golden shadow reveals the best within us that we have not yet claimed, Jung's classical teaching about the shadow refers to the part of ourselves that we repress because they seem negative or shameful or socially unacceptable. But the very things we refuse to face, alone or together, still shape who we become. To paraphrase Jung, until you make the unconscious more conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. Let me repeat that quote because it's really essential for understanding the power and importance of the shadow. Until you make the unconscious more conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So how do we do that? Shadowwork is the name of various practices that help us become more aware of our shadows so that little by little we have something we can work with rather than something that just unconsciously works on us. As the saying goes, the problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious. Here are a few among many examples. If you all had done more therapy, you would have thought that was funnier. But here are a few among many examples of shadow work. Journaling. Writing honestly, even if only privately for yourself, about the emotions, reactions, or patterns you'd rather avoid facing. Noticing emotional triggers, rather than just saying, it's all that other person's fault that I got triggered. Noticing that within yourself and reflecting on, is there something about these particular people or situations that stir unusually strong reactions within me, and letting those reactions become your teachers about your inner life and something you may need to unpack and do some work around. Dream work, reflecting on symbols or themes in your dreams at night that might signal unresolved inner material. Jung says two of the most royal roads to the unconscious is dreams at night and synchronicities during the day, paying attention to meaningful coincidences, these patterns you just keep seeing over and over. And finally, therapy, working with a trained therapist to explore persistent patterns, projections, and wounds, especially when they feel too heavy, confusing, or complex to carry or unpack alone. If you're curious to learn more, I preached a sermon a few years ago that is available in our sermon archive. It's titled Shadowwork, How to Be More Interesting to Yourself and Less Dangerous to Others. There are some people who avoid all forms of shadow work, either consciously or unconsciously, but when we refuse to turn toward our inner life, our shadow again still shapes us from beneath the surface. Until you make the unconscious more conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And the issue is not only individual. Groups and nations have shadows as well. Here's what this means for us as a country right now. When a collective refuses to face its shadow, it too can break into the world in ways that can surprise us, unsettle us, and leave us disoriented. Anyone felt a little unsettled, a little disoriented of late? Most poignantly in the world today, when Donald Trump was first elected president, many commentators dismissed it as a fluke, rather than asking, what are the deeper forces within our collective life that made his rise possible? Now that he has been elected a second time, we are again being invited to look more deeply at the unresolved currents in American life that continue to shape our national story. In 2016, a common refrain was, "This isn't who we are. It can't happen here." But almost a century earlier, in 1935, Sinclair Lewis published a novel satirizing precisely that denial of U.S. citizens about the United States, a book pointedly titled, "It Can't Happen Here." Lewis's novel imagines an authoritarian strongman rising to power here in the U.S., a leader, this is going to be hard for you to imagine, a leader who is charismatic, resentful, thin-skinned, and skilled at turning grievance into political power. His warning, nearly 90 years old, is that when a country refuses to face its own shadow, those forces don't disappear. They find a leader willing to embody and exploit them. Illiberalism and authoritarianism are not new to American democracy. It can and currently is happening here, and it has happened before. Consider just a few moments from our history that bring that shadow into sharper focus. In the 1700s, this is some of you are going to freshly remember this, others could be like kind of dusting off cobwebs, right, from a long time ago U.S. history. The Alien and Sedition Acts made it a crime to criticize the government. In the 1800s, the Fugitive Slave Act compelled ordinary people to aid in enslavement, stripping the accused of even basic due process. The Indian Removal Act forced the displacement and deaths of thousands of native peoples. In the 1900s, the Espionage and Sedition Acts criminalized dissent and anti-war speech during World War I. More than 100,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated unjustly in internment camps during World War II, and McCarthyism destroyed countless lives through baseless accusations. And in the 2000s, after 9/11, our government expanded domestic surveillance in ways that eroded civil liberties, entered a war in Iraq after presenting inaccurate and misleading justifications at the cost of countless lives, and implemented interrogation practices that are internationally recognized as torture. We are not living through something completely unprecedented. We are living through something unresolved in our collective psyche. If this sermon leaves you curious to learn more, I recommend the recent book of essays, Our Fragile Freedoms by Eric Foner, an emeritus professor of history at Columbia University. I first encountered Foner's work through his earlier book, I've also preached about this a few years ago, A Short History of the Reconstruction. It's a condensed version of his Pulitzer Prize-winning Reconstruction, and the subtitle's important, America's Unfinished Revolution. Have any of you read that longer book? It's like over 700 pages. I was like, I'll read the condensed version. It's really good. Foner shows that after the Civil War, Reconstruction failed not because its vision was flawed, but because we, the people, refused to fully, collectively face our shadow around white supremacy. A multiracial, inclusive democracy was within reach, but we lacked the collective courage to make that possibility real. And when a nation avoids its shadow, old wounds reappear in new guises. As with individuals, so too with nations. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So what does collective shadow work? We've talked about individual shadow work. What does collective shadow work look like in practice? Here again are a few among many possible examples. Studying history, as we often do a few times a year here at UUCF, from marginalized perspectives. Telling America's story through the voices of historically oppressed groups. Women, factory workers, African Americans, Native Americans, the working poor, immigrant laborers, letting their experiences reshape how we understand our past, our present, and our future. Public truth-telling, naming past and present harms with honesty and courage so that reckoning becomes possible instead of denial. Truth is needed before you can have reconciliation. Institutional self-examination, looking closely at the systems we have built, noticing where they perpetuate injustice, and committing to real reform, as we've done, in the UUA with our Commission on Institutional Change. Revisiting public memory, reassessing the monuments we elevate, the holidays we celebrate, the stories we teach our children, so that our symbols reflect a fuller and more truthful picture of who we have been and who we aspire to become. In recovery circles, people often talk about reaching a bottom, that point where the pain of avoiding the truth finally outweighs the fear of facing it. Only then does real transformation begin. And the same is true of nations. A country, like a person, can drift for a very long time in denial, resisting the inner work that change requires, but eventually the consequences of that avoidance accumulate, and the question becomes increasingly unavoidable. Have we reached a point where we are finally willing to face what we have tried not to see? And if we can answer yes, even haltingly, even imperfectly, even among merely a critical mass of we the people, then the work of repair can begin. For now, I'm going to limit myself to one brief case study. What would it have been like on January 6th, 2021, if you had been watching TV with Eric Foner, someone who has spent a lifetime doing deep collective shadow work on this country? Foner recalls a commentator saying, quote, "Nothing like this has ever happened before in the United States." Don't ever say something like that in the presence of a historian, because they're going to call BS. Startled by the historical amnesia he was hearing, he found himself shouting back at the television. Anyone ever shouted back at the television? It doesn't really work, but it can be cathartic occasionally. He found himself saying, "That's wrong. What about the Battle of Liberty Place or the Colfax Massacre, violent uprisings a century and a half ago that sought to oust democratically elected state and local governments in Reconstruction, Louisiana, or the 1898 coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina that marked the end of the biracial government in that state?" Now, before reading Foner's work, I didn't really know much about either event in our history, and this is where collective shadow work becomes so important. It raises our awareness of the patterns that we've inherited and the patterns that we need to recognize better if we hope to keep from repeating them. Because that's what happens that's why you go to therapy, because you don't want to keep slipping into these you want to break these habits that are keeping you trapped. Foner describes how the shadows of our past was unmistakably present on January 6th. He said it was shocking, although not really surprising, to see the Confederate battle flag unfurled inside the Capitol. Since the Civil War, Americans who reject inclusive definitions of democracy and freedom have often turned to the Confederacy for inspiration. I am from South Carolina. I can testify to the truth of that statement. This widely reproduced photograph taken that day links our conflict-ridden past with our violent present, depicting a rioter carrying a Confederate flag, while on the walls behind him are portraits of John C. Calhoun on the left, a key architect of pro-slavery ideology, and painfully sometimes described as Unitarianism's racist uncle. He was raised in a prominent Unitarian family, but stood in stark contrast to our tradition's democratic and abolitionist values. Charles Sumner is on the right, interestingly, a staunch defender of the rights of Black Americans. You could also ask yourself, why is John C. Calhoun's portrait still hanging in the Capitol? Also in this photo, Richard Nixon, a president whose Southern strategy, again, why is his bust in the Capitol? Why was he not put in, pardoning him is part of the problem. Anyway, I don't have time to talk about that. A president whose Southern strategy employed thinly veiled racism to attract the votes of white Democrats, alarmed by the social and political changes brought about by the Civil Rights Revolution. Yeah. Why have we given Trump all this pardon power? Because we didn't deal with it back when it was misused with. Anyway, okay. A lot more to say. This photograph is more than a record of a single moment. This photograph is a mirror. It reflects both of some of the deepest betrayals of our democracy, but also some of our most courageous defenders of it. Looking in this mirror reminds us that the past is never past until its shadow has been brought into the light and integrated into our present, so that we might have a better future. Collective shadow work matters deeply. But there's an important caution to name as well. If shadow work becomes our only lens, it can leave us with this unduly bleak sense of who we are as a people. A steady diet of critique without any recognitions of our strengths as a country can distort our vision just as surely as denial does. And that's where we need to come full circle and remember the importance of not only is there an individual golden shadow, there's a collective golden shadow as well. The parts of our shared story that reveal courage, imagination, and moral possibility waiting to be reclaimed. Foner's book lifts up a number of figures who embody that golden shadow. Thomas Paine, who declared that we need no kings to rule us here in the U.S. Instead, we, the people, can govern ourselves and shape our own destiny. Frederick Douglass, who transformed his own liberation into a lifetime struggle for universal freedom, forcing our nation to confront the hypocrisy between our ideals and our practice. He said, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" Right? Florence Kelley, whose tenacity helped end child labor, expand workers' rights, and build the foundation of a more humane economy. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who showed through the New Deal that government at its best can lift millions out of despair and that true freedom includes economic security. Eugene Debs, who preached not only political equality and economic freedom, but also a moral vision, the conviction that extreme inequality, it's wrong. Billionaires are wrong. Trillionaires are wronger. And that ordinary people acting together can create far-reaching change. Their lives and the lives of so many others, Susan B. Anthony, Rosa Parks, James Baldwin, we could go on, remind us that the rights we cherish today were not these gifts from above. They were the hard-won achievements of our ancestors who refused to accept that injustice is inevitable, that this too is America. This too is part of who we can become. Relatedly, my ears perked up during Zohran Mamdani's victory speech as mayor-elect of New York City, when at the very beginning, he began with these words, quote, "The sun may have set over our city this evening, but as Eugene Debs once said," I was like, oh, I'm listening, Eugene Debs, quote, "I can see the dawn of a better day for humanity." For those of us learning to see our collective shadow more clearly, that line may ring a bell. It comes from Debs's sentencing statement in 1918, delivered after he had been unjustly convicted by the Espionage Act, one of the collective shadows in U.S. history that we explored earlier. Debs's address to the federal court was delivered just 2 days after the jury found him guilty of speaking out against World War I. More people should have been speaking up against World War I. Again, I did a sermon on that too, so it's in our archive. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison for nothing more than exercising the kind of free speech that the First Amendment was written to protect. Debs ultimately served about 2.5 years until President Harding commuted his sentence. To quote another famous passage from Debs's statement to the court that day, he said, quote, "Years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings. While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul imprisoned, I am not free." Those words echo across more than a century because they come from someone who had done the hard work, inner and outer, of facing the world as it truly is, and then choosing not despair, but solidarity. Shadow work, whether individual or collective, is not about getting stuck in our struggles. It's not about shaming ourselves about our past. I guarantee you this, we can all give up hope, individually or collectively, give up all hope of a better past. We're not getting that. It is about seeing our past clearly enough to choose more wisely and compassionately in the present instead of just unconsciously repeating the patterns of the past. It's about refusing to let what is unconscious run our lives or our country. It is about telling the truth so that a better future can become possible. We are also called to remember our golden shadow. Courage, creativity, and moral imagination are not the property alone of great figures in history. They are capabilities that lead within us. They are within us. Go to that workshop that Lisa's leading during the middle hour to learn more. Which brings us to the question before us today. In this fragile and fearful moment in our democracy, we must ask ourselves not simply what shadows must we face, but what strengths are we ready to claim? What kind of people, what kind of nation do we choose to become? We cannot control the storms around us, but we can control how do I choose to act in my spheres of influence. What is the next right action, and what's the next right action after that? History is not just our inheritance, it is our ongoing co-creation, the society that we are shaping for future generations. May we be among those who choose courage over comfort, clarity over denial, and solidarity over despair. May we have the courage to face the truth of our past, the imagination to claim what is best within us now, and the solidarity to build a future in which all of us are free.